October 15, 1944, the Vosges Mountains of northeastern France. Cold rain falls through a ceiling of fog so thick that soldiers on opposite sides of a narrow road cannot see one another. Below the ridgelines in the small textile town of Bruyères, a German garrison waits behind stone walls, minefields, and log-covered machine gun positions built into the hillsides. Adolf Hitler has ordered his commanders on this front to hold at all costs. The Vosges are the last significant natural barrier standing between the Allied armies pushing east from Marseille and the German border itself. If Bruyères falls, the road to the Rhine opens. Moving up through the mud and shattered timber to attack that town is a United States Army regiment unlike any other in the European theater of operations. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a unit composed almost entirely of Nisei, second-generation Japanese-American soldiers. Many of these men had volunteered directly out of the barbed wire enclosures of the American government's own wartime incarceration camps, where their families were being held under armed guard while they prepared to fight for the country that had imprisoned them. What happened over the next 2 weeks in the forests above Bruyères, and in the deeper fighting that followed at Bifontaine and in the rescue of the so-called Lost Battalion, would become one of the most costly and most decorated actions fought by any American infantry unit in the war. It would also leave a documented impression on the German soldiers and officers who faced the 442nd across those hillsides, an impression recorded not in a single dramatic quotation, but in the operational record itself, in the defenses the Germans built, in the orders they issued, in the plans they abandoned, and in the accounts German prisoners and officers gave once they were captured. This is the story of how that impression was made. By the autumn of 1944, the war in Western Europe had entered a grinding, attritional phase. The rapid liberation of Paris in August had given way to a slower, harder fight as Allied supply lines stretched thin and German forces fell back toward prepared defensive lines closer to their own border. In the south, the U.S. 7th Army, which had landed in Operation Dragoon along the Mediterranean coast in mid-August, was advancing north through the Rhone Valley and into the foothills of the Vosges Mountains. The Vosges presented a defensive gift to the German Army Group G. The range is not especially high, its peaks rarely exceed a few thousand feet, but it is densely forested, cut by narrow valleys, and in October 1944, soaked by weeks of continuous cold rain, roads turned to mud. Streams flooded, visibility in the fir forests dropped to a matter of yards. German engineers had spent weeks preparing log bunkers, interlocking machine gun positions, and extensive minefields along the high ground overlooking the approaches to towns such as Bruyères. The 442nd itself arrived in this theater only after an already demanding journey. Having fought through the Italian campaign, the regiment left Naples and landed at Marseille on September 30, 1944. From there it traveled roughly 500 miles north through the Rhone Valley, moving by foot and by boxcar over the following 2 weeks, before reaching its assembly area near the Vosges front on October 13. The men had trained originally in the pine forests and swampland of Camp Shelby, Mississippi, and had since adapted to the very different terrain of the Italian mountains. The Vosges presented yet another environment again, colder, wetter, and even more densely forested than anything the regiment had fought through before. Hitler's directive to hold the Vosges at all costs was not rhetorical. German units in this sector, including elements of the 16th Volksgrenadier Division and SS Polizei Regiment 19, were ordered to defend in place rather than conduct the more flexible, mobile defense that characterized German doctrine elsewhere. This meant that the Americans advancing into the Vosges, including the 36th Infantry Division, to which the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was attached, along with French units such as the 3rd Algerian Infantry Division, would not be facing a retreating enemy. They would be facing a German force under direct orders to fight to the last position, in terrain that overwhelmingly favored the defender. Existing Allied tactics for open, mobile warfare, the kind that had worked in the drive north from the Mediterranean coast, were poorly suited to this environment. Tanks and vehicles bogged down on the narrow forest tracks. Artillery observation was limited by fog and tree cover. Infantry had to fight uphill, tree line by tree line, often at ranges of only a few yards, against an enemy dug into fortified positions that had been prepared for weeks in advance. The town of Bruyères itself sat at the center of this problem. A small textile and lumber town in a valley of the Vosges foothills, it was ringed by 4 hills the Americans designated Hill A, Hill B, Hill C, and Hill D. Hill A to the northwest, Hill B to the north, Hill C to the northeast, and Hill D to the east. Whoever held those 4 hills controlled every approach into the town below. German engineers had used the weeks before the American arrival to convert the wooded high ground into a continuous belt of fortified positions, so that any unit attempting to take one hill would come under fire from at least one of the others. This was the tactical puzzle handed to the 36th Infantry Division and to the regiment that would be tasked with solving the northern half of it. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team was activated on February 1, 1943, following a decision by the War Department to form a segregated Army unit made up of Japanese-American volunteers, after initially barring Nisei from combat service in the wake of Pearl Harbor. It absorbed the already blooded 100th Infantry Battalion, a unit formed from Japanese-American members of the Hawaii Territorial Guard and National Guard, which had already fought with distinction in Italy at Cassino and Anzio before the 442nd itself deployed. Approximately 14,000 men served in the regiment over the course of the war, drawn from two very different communities. Nisei volunteers from the territory of Hawaii and mainland Nisei, many of whom volunteered directly from the 10 War Relocation Authority camps where Japanese-American families had been forcibly removed and incarcerated following Executive Order 9066. At the operational level, the 442nd fought as part of Major General John E. Dahlquist's 36th Infantry Division, itself part of Lieutenant General Alexander Patch's 7th Army. Dahlquist would order the regiment into the assault on Bruyères and only days later into the far costlier mission to reach the lost battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, 36th Division, a Texas National Guard unit that had become surrounded deep in German-held forest. On the German side, the defenders at Bruyères included troops of SS Polizei Regiment 19, holding fortified positions on the hill the Americans designated Hill A, along with elements of the German 16th Volksgrenadier Division and supporting units under 19th Army Command in this sector of Army Group G. These were not second-line garrison troops. SS Polizei formations were combat units integrated into the regular order of battle, and the defenses they had constructed around Bruyères, log bunkers, wire and pre-registered artillery and mortar fire, reflected weeks of preparation under direct orders to hold ground rather than withdraw. At the level of the individual soldier, the fighting at Bruyères and in the days that followed produced a documented cluster of individual acts of valor that the U.S. Army would recognize, in several cases only decades later. Staff Sergeant Robert T. Kuroda, moving with a carrying party bringing ammunition forward near Bruyères, came under fire from German positions. He moved alone against them, killing 3 German soldiers with grenades and killing or wounding 3 more with his rifle before he was killed by a sniper. He was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, an award upgraded to the Medal of Honor in a formal Army review completed in 2000. Technical Sergeant Yukio Okutsu of the 100th Infantry Battalion was likewise awarded the Medal of Honor for actions during the same October 1944 fighting around Bruyères. Private George Sakato, fighting through the advance toward the town on October 18, later described the experience of being pinned under German artillery and small arms fire in blunt, unembellished terms, recalling that he felt scared as hell and prayed while he fired, an account preserved in the regiment's own oral histories, and later cited in his own Medal of Honor citation, itself an award upgraded decades after the war following the same 1990s Army review. The German defense of the Vosges in October 1944 was not improvised. It was, in a real sense, the product of an earlier German failure to hold the line further south and west. Army Group G had already been pushed back rapidly through southern France after the Allied landings in August, losing the ability to fight the kind of mobile, counterattacking battles German commanders preferred. By the time American and French forces reached the Vosges approaches, German commanders had shifted to a strategy of static defense in depth, using the mountainous terrain itself as a force multiplier to offset their declining manpower and armor. That strategy nearly worked. The 36th Division's advance into the hills above Bruyères in the days before October 15 had been slow and costly, with other regiments of the division unable to dislodge German positions on the high ground by direct assault. The town of Bruyères sat in a valley ringed by 4 hills the Americans labeled A, B, C, and D, each one covered in dense fir forest and each one fortified. Frontal attacks against these positions in the preceding days had made only limited progress against German machine gun and mortar fire directed from prepared, mutually supporting positions. It was into this stalled situation that the 442nd was committed on October 15, 1944, tasked with taking hills A and B, while other American units pushed into the town itself. Veterans of the 3rd Infantry Division, who had themselves fought through the brutal Italian campaign at Anzio, would later describe the fighting in the Vosges forests as worse than what they had experienced there, a measure of just how difficult the terrain and German resistance proved to be for experienced American troops. The tactical breakthrough at Bruyères did not come from a single dramatic maneuver, but from relentless, close-range infantry fighting, conducted in conditions that neutralized most of the advantages a modern, mechanized army would normally hold. On October 15, the 100th Infantry Battalion attacked Hill A, defended by SS Polizei Regiment 19, the 2nd Battalion attacked Hill B, and the 3rd Battalion pushed directly into Bruyères itself, supported by the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion's 105 howitzers, which fired in support of the advancing infantry despite the fog limiting visual observation of targets. The fighting through the forested hillsides required squads to clear German bunkers and machine gun nests at extremely close range, often crawling through mud and undergrowth to get within grenade-throwing distance of a fortified position before the defenders could bring flanking fire to bear. Progress was measured in yards rather than miles. After more than 6 hours of fighting on the morning of October 18, L Company of the 3rd Battalion pushed into Bruyères and linked up with C Company of the 36th Division's 143rd Infantry Regiment, which had entered the town from the south, a coordinated pincer that finally broke the German hold on the town itself. Hills A and B were secured within the first 3 days of fighting, but Hills C and D, still held by German forces, required a further, separate assault beginning on October 19. That fighting cost more than 100 additional American casualties before the hills were finally taken. One of the men killed in the assault on Hill D was Technical Sergeant Abraham Ohama of F Company. In his memory, the men of the 442nd began calling the position Ohama's Hill, a name that has remained attached to the site in the regiment's own histories. The fighting for Bruyères was not confined to the four hills alone. As the 442nd's anti-tank company and supporting elements worked to secure the ground taken, they also carried out tasks that fell well outside conventional infantry assault work. Clearing German minefields laid throughout the approaches to the town, capturing German soldiers attempting to slip through the lines, and guarding the roads and rail tunnels that ran through the valley, protecting the exposed right flank of the 7th Army as the wider offensive continued around them. This combination of direct assault, engineering-level hazard clearance, and static security work over difficult terrain placed a continuous strain on a regiment that had already been fighting without significant rest since its move into position on the afternoon of October 14. During the pursuit of retreating German forces north of Bruyères, toward the wooded area around Belmont, a soldier of K Company shot a German officer and recovered from him a complete set of German defensive plans for the sector. Using that captured intelligence, F and L companies, led by Major Emmett O'Connor, were able to infiltrate German lines and strike positions the enemy had not expected to be exposed. A direct, documented instance of the 442nd exploiting captured German operational planning to accelerate the collapse of the defense north of the town. The immediate operational result of the fighting at Bruyères was the collapse of the German defensive line that had been intended to hold the approaches to the Vosges passes, but the regiment was given almost no time to rest. Within days of clearing Bruyères, the 100th Battalion was ordered east to the village of Bifontaine, where it was quickly surrounded by German forces who brought heavy artillery and rocket fire down on the isolated American position, a measure of how determined German commanders in this sector remained to contain and destroy any American penetration of their line, even after losing Bruyères itself. The most consequential test of the regiment's effectiveness, and the action for which it remains most widely remembered, followed almost immediately. Major General Dahlquist ordered the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, a Texas National Guard unit, to advance several miles beyond the supporting friendly line into the forest east of Bruyères. Officers warned that the advance risked the battalion being cut off. It was within a short time, surrounded on three sides by German forces, reinforced, according to the regiment's own after-action accounts, by roughly 6,000 fresh German troops ordered to hold their positions at any cost, with no authorization to surrender or withdraw. More than 270 men of the lost battalion were trapped on a forested ridge near the town of Saint-Dié, cut off from resupply, evacuation, or reinforcement. The 442nd, still recovering from the fighting at Bruyères and Bifontaine, was ordered back into the line to break through to the trapped Texans. What followed was 5 days of some of the most costly close quarters fighting the regiment experienced in the entire war, advancing yard by yard through the same dense, fog-bound forest terrain that had already proven so costly at Bruyères, against German troops under the same rigid no-retreat orders. On October 30, 1944, elements of the 442nd broke through and reached the survivors of the lost battalion. The regiment's own veterans organizations, drawing on after-action reports and interviews conducted in the decades since, describe the final approach to the trapped battalion as a slow, exhausting push through terrain that gave the advancing companies almost no cover beyond individual trees, while German positions on higher ground could observe and fire down on nearly every yard of open approach. Individual acts of extreme risk-taking under this fire were later recognized with the nation's highest award for valor. Private First Class Sado Munemori, of the 100th Battalion, threw himself onto a German grenade to save 2 wounded comrades near Bifontaine during this same period of fighting. An act for which he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Japanese-American to receive the award during World War II, though, as with several of his fellow soldiers, full national recognition of the scale of Nisei valor in this campaign would not come until decades later. The cost of the rescue was severe and is well documented in the regiment's official casualty figures. The 100th and 442nd suffered a combined total of 814 casualties, including 140 dead, in the course of rescuing 211 survivors of the lost battalion, a ratio that has been cited repeatedly in official U.S. government recognitions of the unit, including congressional resolutions honoring the regiment. Some individual rifle companies within the regiment were reduced to a fraction of their authorized strength. Accounts from the unit's own veterans organizations describe companies going into the Vosges fighting with roughly 200 men and coming out with fewer than 20 still able to fight, though exact company-level figures vary between sources and should be treated as approximate rather than precisely uniform across every unit. The pattern of fighting demonstrated at Bruyères, Bifontaine, and in the rescue of the lost battalion was not an isolated event within the regiment's service record. The 442nd, together with the 100th Infantry Battalion, fought in 8 major campaigns across Italy and France over the course of the war, including the earlier battles at Cassino, Anzio, and the breakthrough of German positions along the Gothic Line in Italy, where, according to accounts compiled by veterans organizations, roughly 3,000 riflemen of the 100th and 442nd achieved in a single night assault what 2 full divisions totaling roughly 40,000 men had failed to accomplish over the preceding 6 months, by scaling a steep, undefended cliff face under cover of darkness and breaching the German line from a direction the defenders had not prepared against. The regiment's fighting record in Italy, established before it ever reached France, forms an important part of understanding why it was trusted with the difficult assignments it received in the Vosges. The 100th Infantry Battalion began its combat service in Italy in September 1943, fighting through the Salerno beachhead, the mountains around Cassino, and the Anzio beachhead before the full 442nd Regimental Combat Team joined the fight. It was this Italian campaign experience, hard-won knowledge of mountain fighting, small unit infiltration, and close coordination with supporting artillery that the regiment carried with it into the very different but equally punishing terrain of the Vosges. By the end of the war, the 100th 442nd Regimental Combat Team had become the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in the history of the United States Army, a record that includes 21 Medals of Honor, several awarded posthumously decades later, after a 1990s Army review found evidence that racial bias had led to some Nisei soldiers' valor being under-recognized at the time. 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, 559 Silver Stars, more than 4,000 Bronze Stars, 9 Presidential Unit Citations, and 9,486 Purple Hearts, a Purple Heart count so high relative to the unit's size that it earned the regiment the nickname, the Purple Heart Battalion, among soldiers elsewhere in the Army. The military impact of the fighting at Bruyères and in the rescue of the lost battalion was immediate and tactical. The collapse of a German defensive line that Hitler's own directives had ordered held at all costs, and the extraction of an isolated American battalion that German commanders had committed thousands of fresh troops specifically to destroy. In that narrow sense, the operation succeeded exactly as intended. But the wider impact of the 442nd service reached well beyond the Vosges campaign itself. At the time these men were fighting and dying in French forests, their own families remained confined behind barbed wire in war relocation authority camps across the American West, under a policy justified at the time by unfounded claims about the loyalty of Japanese Americans as a group. The documented combat record of the 100th and 442nd, repeatedly assembled and cited in the decades since by the U.S. government itself, including in the Congressional Gold Medal legislation passed in 2010, became one of the most concrete pieces of evidence used to challenge that policy's underlying premise, both during the war and in the long process of official apology and redress that followed decades later. The regiment's later service also carried direct historical weight of its own. In the closing weeks of the war in Europe, elements connected to the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, which had fought alongside the 442nd throughout the Vosges campaign, were among the American forces that reached and helped liberate subcamps associated with the Dachau concentration camp system in Bavaria in the final days of April 1945, placing soldiers whose own families had been unjustly imprisoned by their own government among the first Allied troops to witness and help end the far greater crime of the Nazi camp system. The human cost of the Vosges campaign also shaped how the regiment was remembered within the army itself for years afterward. The casualty rate suffered in the rescue of the lost battalion alone, 814 casualties to save 211 men, became a recurring reference point in official histories precisely because of how disproportionate it was, and it fed directly into the regiment's overall reputation within the army as a unit that, whatever the cost, did not leave a mission incomplete. That reputation, built in the space of roughly 2 weeks of fighting in October 1944, followed the 100th and 442nd through the remainder of the war in Italy and into the post-war decades, shaping how the unit's veterans were treated by fellow soldiers even in an army that, at the level of federal policy, had not yet come to terms with the injustice its own government had done to those same soldiers' families. The town of Bruyères has never allowed the memory of October 1944 to fade. A monument stands near the town, erected by the Japanese-American Citizens League, honoring the members of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team who were killed in the battle, and inscribed with a statement that the unit reaffirmed an historic truth here, that loyalty to one's country is not modified by racial origin. To this day, schoolchildren in Bruyères learn to sing Aloha-o and Hawaii Panai as part of their local curriculum, a direct, living link between a small French town and the largely Hawaii and mainland-drawn regiment that liberated it. In the United States, recognition of the regiment's record was slow, and for decades incomplete, a delay that historians and the Army's own later review both attribute in part to the same racial prejudice the unit had fought to disprove on the battlefield. It was not until a formal Army review in the 1990s that several Nisei soldiers, including Sado Munemori and eventually others connected to the regiment's Vosges fighting, had their Valor Awards upgraded to the Medal of Honor, decades after their actions. In 2010, the United States Congress passed legislation awarding the Congressional Gold Medal collectively to the 100th Infantry Battalion, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and the Military Intelligence Service, formally recognizing their World War II service at the highest civilian level available. The battle for Bruyères and the rescue of the lost battalion remain, to this day, central case studies in U.S. Army history education on unit cohesion, close-terrain infantry tactics, and the human cost of committing an isolated force too deep into contested ground, a lesson drawn directly from Major General Dahlquist's original order, sending the 141st Infantry forward beyond supporting distance. The organizations descended from the regiment's veterans continue to maintain the unit's official history and battlefield records, preserving primary source material, after-action reports, casualty rolls, and veteran interviews that historians continue to draw on today. The gap between what is thoroughly documented about the American experience of this battle and what survives in accessible form about specific German assessments of the 442nd is itself a notable feature of the historical record. Unit-level German war diaries and after-action reports for formations such as SS Polizei Regiment 19 and the 16th Volksgrenadier Division exist in German and French military archives. And post-war interrogation reports of captured German officers from this sector occasionally touch on the intensity of the fighting they faced, but a single, widely sourced verbatim German assessment naming the 442nd specifically has not been established with the same level of certainty as the American operational record. A responsible historical account distinguishes between the two: the documented facts of what the Germans did, the orders to hold at all costs, the commitment of thousands of additional troops to contain the lost battalion rescue, the failure of a defense built and reinforced over weeks, and the more fragmentary, harder-to-verify record of what individual German officers and soldiers said about the men they were fighting. Museums and archives on both sides of the Atlantic now hold the physical record of that fighting. The National Archives and Records Administration retains period photographs from the battle, including images of Nisei soldiers walking past a disabled German half-track in the streets of Bruyères on October 24, 1944, just days after the town's liberation. University and Veterans Organization archives in Hawaii and on the American mainland hold thousands of pages of soldier correspondence, unit rosters, and after-action reports from the campaign, material that has supported multiple full-length historical works on the regiment, including Masco Dewes's Unlikely Liberators and James M. McCaffrey's Going for Broke, both of which draw on extensive interviews with surviving veterans of the 100th and 442nd conducted in the decades after the war. This body of documentation is part of why the Bruyères campaign remains one of the most thoroughly reconstructed small unit actions of the European campaign, even as the specific, moment-by-moment German assessment of the regiment they were fighting remains, in places, harder to reconstruct than the American side of the same battle. The problem that faced American and French commanders in October 1944 was, on paper, a simple one: a determined German force, ordered to hold at all costs, occupying near-ideal defensive terrain in the Vosges Mountains, standing in the way of the Allied advance toward the German border. The solution that broke that line was not a new weapon or a clever maneuver, but a regiment of Japanese-American soldiers, many of them fighting for a country that had imprisoned their own families, advancing yard by yard through fog and mud to clear fortified positions the German army had spent weeks preparing to defend. What German commanders concluded about the men they faced in those forests was recorded not in a single preserved quotation, but in the decisions they made under pressure, in orders to hold ground at any cost that nonetheless failed to stop the American advance, in a captured defense plan that gave away their own position, and in the commitment of thousands of fresh troops specifically to try to destroy an isolated American unit rather than simply contain it. The German army treated the sector held by the 442nd and the 36th Division as one requiring its most rigid no-retreat defense, and that defense broke anyway. It is worth being precise about what can and cannot be claimed with confidence from the surviving record. What is firmly established is this: a German force under direct orders from the highest level of command to hold the Vosges at any cost built one of the most heavily fortified defensive belts the 36th Division encountered in the European campaign, reinforced it with thousands of additional troops when the line was breached, and was nonetheless pushed back, town by town and hill by hill, by a regiment that had trained for a different kind of war entirely. Whatever specific words individual German officers used to describe the 442nd in the moment, the operational choices German commanders made, the scale of reinforcement, the refusal to permit retreat, the willingness to absorb enormous losses rather than concede the ground, speak, in the language of military records rather than quotation, to how seriously that regiment was taken by the men trying to stop it. More than 80 years later, the fighting at Bruyères still matters, not only as a case study in mountain and forest warfare, but as a documented answer to the very question the United States government had asked in 1942 about the loyalty of its own Japanese-American citizens. The men of the 100th and 442nd answered that question in the Vosges Mountains, at a cost measured in the hundreds of casualties recorded in their own regiment's official history, a cost paid, deliberately, to bring 211 trapped soldiers of another regiment home.